Hello, everybody, and welcome to another conversation here with Dan.
Howdy, folks.
It's good to see you all again. It has been a busy month of feedback.
It has.
I think I feel like we mentioned in one of the videos that we always enjoy some good feedback and different things, and y'all did not disappoint.
They've been feeding back.
Yeah, we've gotten emails and texts and things, comments on the videos. We've seen some really good discussions happening on some of even the shorts that we've been putting out.
On other platforms?
On like Facebook and different things. So kind of wherever you are, we appreciate you engaging with this, and it's led to some really good discussions. So today's video, we're actually going to follow up on a couple of the quick questions that have come in to us based off of some of those videos, all right?
So the first one comes off of that one we did about the sermon.
The sermon, yes. And so we're going to look at one of the passages that seems to be talking about things that are happening in the worship service. And so it's a two-part question.
It just doesn't seem to. It is. It says, when you come together.
Okay, there we go. I don't want to speak out of turn as we jump into this.
Yeah.
But I'll read both parts of the question, and then we can kind of dissect it.
All right.
All right. So the first part of this question was, who is the everyone being discussed in 1 Corinthians 14:26 and following? Is it everyone who received a word from God? Is Greek everyone, inclusive to men and women, or just male ministers and elders? And then as a follow-up to that, were the sermons teaching one way at or to an audience, like we experience today, or what we think of in a class, where there's a class and teacher, but there's occasional input from the attendees? Is that where this anyone has coming into play there in 1 Corinthians?
Wow, there's a lot in that.
There is.
Let's address the first part first. If everybody will turn to 1 Corinthians 14,
all right,
verse 26.
Let's see.
Jed's got an ESV over there.
I do. All right.
Read it.
14:26.
Yep.
What then, brothers? When you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up.
All right. So the questioner's translation that they were reading said everyone. And if you'll, any of you that are looking at a Greek text there, the word is ekastos. Ekastos is a word that picks out individuals, each individual. Let me show you in the previous context. If you go back, for example, to chapter 12, go to verse 11. He's talking about spiritual gifts and how God gives spiritual gifts to individual members. Go ahead, verse 11.
It says, all these are empowered by one and the same Spirit, who apportions to each one individually as he wills.
So that last part of 1 Corinthians 12:11, he apportions to each one, that's to each individual member of the church, just as he will. Then if you go down to verse 18, he's talking about the church as a body, and each member as a part of the body.
But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose.
That is ekastos, that's the same word. It's in a different case, the accusative case, but exactly the same word.
Okay.
So you have that same word in verse 11, the same word in verse 18, the same word in 1 Corinthians 14:26.
Okay.
So in the context of chapters 12 through 14, actually 11 through 14, starting in the Lord's Supper thing, the word indicates individual Christians in the body of Christ. He uses the same word in Ephesians 4:7, where he says, to each one of us is this grace given according to the measure of the gift of Christ. He's talking about how God gives spiritual gifts to each individual member of the body. Okay? So in the context of the assembly, in 1 Corinthians 14, those different members having different gifts, and he highlights the gifts of tongues and prophecy, and says he would rather see people use the gift of prophecy in the assembly so that everybody could understand, rather than tongues where that nobody could understand.
Gotcha.
Unless there was an interpreter. Okay.
So now we come to this. So each one doesn't mean that like everyone in the assembly has to speak at some
Not
point.
at all. It's talking about each individual who does speak in the assembly. And then if you follow verse 26, he gives three scenarios in verse 27 and following. First is tongue speakers. And he says, now, don't let more than 2 or 3 do that, and only if there's an interpreter.
Right.
Then he deals with prophets, and he says,
they're in verse 29.
More than 2 or 3 can do that, and then if a revelation comes to the others, one should be silent. And then he deals with women and says, I don't want women to be speaking in the assembly. He says, let them be silent.
Right.
So it does not refer to women in verse 26.
Okay, and that's verse 34.
That's right.
Through. Okay.
So, and that's just strictly sticking with the flow of the context.
Right.
Okay? So each one would be, in verse 26, each one who has a teaching or a prophecy or whatever, if they're going to get up in turn, that would be the reference to that. It should be translated each one.
Okay.
Because it's the word ekastos.
Yeah. So each one who has, and then fill in the blank with the rest of the examples there. Okay. So at that point, kind of getting to that part B, if these things were happening during the worship service, does that mean that there was more give and take in the ancient worship services? There was less like one person up front doing everything, and there was a little bit more, hey, different people will be interacting together in some fashion.
That would have probably been more a cultural thing, because the culture in Corinth was certainly different than the culture in Palestine. I think probably where the questioner's coming from, I'm just assuming, and I may be completely wrong, in the Jewish synagogue.
Okay, yeah.
Which, especially in Palestine and maybe in other places, there would have been opportunity somewhere for other teachers to interact with the teacher that was on the floor. And so they might say, but what about this question? And the teacher may answer. See?
Okay.
But that was more a facet of the Jewish synagogue, and very likely not a facet of the Greek-type assembly that would have been going on in Corinth at this point. Though we don't know. We can't really answer that question. There's nothing in the text that suggests it.
But it kind of, I mean, if he's talking to Corinth, and so he's talking to a Greek setup here, and he's saying, so if these things are happening, let all it be done for the building up. We don't know if it's like interrupting, but it's definitely a mixture of things happening.
Yes, there are some songs going on. There are some prophecies going on. If there's an interpreter, there may be a tongue speaker that's giving a teaching in a different tongue and having it interpreted. But he says clearly in the verses that follow verse 26, he's emphasizing each to take their turn, speaking at the front, and let it be done decently and in order, not in a way of confusion. Yeah.
So obviously not an all-out, like everybody noises from everywhere calling out. But it almost feels like like in a classroom, you put your hand up and you're like, hey, I've got a thing. And
there's nothing in the text itself that would suggest that.
Okay. So we look at the cultures, and I guess we could walk away by saying in the worship there would be a variety of things happening, and there's no set, this has to be the way it's done. It just has to be orderly as a general rule.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So
now you have other settings. For example, you have in Acts 18, and you're talking about the Ephesians, and Paul was reasoning daily in the school of Tyrannus. Now, in a setting like that, you would certainly have questions and back and forth and everything.
Right.
That was in more of an academic give and take setting, but there's nothing in the actual text of 1 Corinthians that would indicate that.
Okay. So I guess my kind of practical question for this would be, so let's say you go into a congregation that you've never been to, and the preacher gets up and he starts giving his sermon, and then someone from the audience raises their hand and asks a question or something in the middle of the sermon, and that's normal to them, and they just flow with it, and it keeps going. And you may feel like, oh, that's very different. In my church, the preacher starts and everyone else keeps quiet the whole time. There's nothing that says, oh, it has to be one way or the other. It could be how do we culturally want to process this?
Maybe. I've actually had an occasion where somebody interrupted my sermon not in a nice way.
And that would be a different. I think that would be a different discussion.
And it was definitely in a way that was out of order. And I forget the exact words I used, but it was probably something to the effect of, we can talk about that in another time, but right now we're going to proceed with our lesson, and I went ahead and proceeded with the lesson. So, yeah.
But if it's happening somewhere and they're used to it, and that's kind of it's more the small group, we give and we take and we learn together.
Yeah, if you were in a house setting or something, yeah, maybe so. I hadn't thought about it, so I really don't have an answer for that right now.
And like you say, there's not like a textual...
There's no textual reference for me, so that's...
Yeah, there we go.
That's where I like to stand, is on the text.
You could go out and toss us some ideas or send us a video and we'll look at it and just for fun. Because there are different places that do it different ways. And I think some of the question is, should we be doing it or is it okay to be doing it? And I think the answer would be, as long as it falls under that orderly umbrella.
Well, you could make that argument with a lot of things.
I'm just talking about like the nature of...
Yeah, but again, where do you get it in the text? And I would always go back to that. So
yeah. Well, again, where do we have in the text that it's one guy who stands up and talks for 30 minutes?
We don't have that at all.
There we go.
So while we're at it,
yeah,
and we're in the assembly part, why don't you do that one about
which one?
About the church building?
Oh, yeah,
we're right in that passage.
Yeah. So another thing that someone sent in, and I don't remember which video particularly it was related to, but someone just asked the question: is the church building sacred?
No.
Straight and easy.
Okay, but on that one, we need to say that there's no biblical precedent for a church building.
Okay.
Now, you do have houses that people met in Romans 16, the church that is in their house.
Yeah.
There's, in James chapter 2, if a man comes into your synagogue, someone could translate that as assembly and be correct in that translation.
Okay.
It also can refer to a building.
Okay.
And so it very well may be that in James, who was a very Jewish leader, the church was actually meeting in a synagogue that had become Christian.
Yeah.
See?
Yeah.
And so it's possible that that's true.
Were the synagogue... Pause on that one for a second. Were the synagogues sacred spaces?
No, not in the same sense as the temple was.
Okay.
The temple was a holy place.
Right. It was set apart.
Synagogues were not sacred spaces.
They were just classroom spaces, essentially.
Yeah, they were buildings.
Yeah. Okay.
But they were not ordained by God as set apart by God. So no, they were not.
So there's nothing like if you were to say, oh, the synagogue, and that means that it was some special set-apart space. And so applying it to here, someone may say, oh, we went into the synagogue.
Yeah, but that would be misinformed. If you go back to 1 Corinthians 11 and go to verse 20 through 22, if you would, please, there.
All right. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry and another gets drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in, or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not.
Okay, the word ecclesia in 1 Corinthians 11 has no reference to a building, whatever. It means the gathering, the group, the assembly.
Okay.
When you come together in ecclesia, when you come together in the assembly. So he's saying that the assembly of God, the Sunday Lord's Supper assembly, is not the place for common meals. It is a place to eat the Lord's Supper, not your own supper. He's not talking about whether you can eat in the building or not. That's not even anywhere in the context at all.
He's not saying if you bring your Starbucks in, you're somehow desecrating the space.
No, but he's not talking about fellowship meals or anything like that.
All that
after
too.
The assembly, he's talking about what goes on in the worship assembly.
Okay. So in all of that, there's nothing biblically that says the space that you gather in is somehow sanctified and holy.
No.
Similar to the temple was.
Not at all. In fact, quite the opposite.
Okay. Because they could have met anywhere, anytime.
Then they did. Synagogues were a dime a dozen.
Okay. All right, so we've gone through a couple of those. Let's see, there was one other one that I was looking at and talking about. Oh, yeah. The idea of reconciliation came up. He loves it when I throw these sort of things at him. The idea of reconciliation came up at the end of our discussion about the Trinity. And someone had replied back just asking for a little bit of an expansion on that, and they had used the idea of a cosmic reconciliation. And we at the end were talking about Jesus being a bridge between man and God, and that ultimate reconciliation between God and man. Mm-hmm. But I think that there's a couple different versions of reconciliation or forms of reconciliation that people kind of lump together as one whole.
Well, the problem I had, and it's I don't know exactly what was on the questioner's mind. When they say cosmic, I think of the Greek word cosmos, which is the universe, the world, the created universe.
Yeah.
I did not know whether they had in mind the reconciliation of the creation, the created world to God, or did they have in mind a passage like Colossians 1, what was it, 20? Colossians 1, verse 20.
Okay.
We might start just a little bit before that with about verse 19 or so, even 18.
All right, let's start there. So Colossians 1:18, and he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross.
Okay, so it's possible that the questioner had this in mind, and I'll confess to everybody out there that this is a very challenging verse to me.
Okay.
Because I'll get that later. I do not know exactly what this passage has reference to. If you read in Ephesians 2, verse 14 through 16, he's talking about through the death of Christ on the cross, he reconciled first Jews and Gentiles to each other.
Right.
Then in verse 16, that he might reconcile both of them, that's Jew and Gentile, in one body unto God through the cross. So Jew and Gentile both were brought back together with God through the redemptive work of Christ on the cross, because that was the only thing that could take the separation of sin between them and God out and reconcile all of them to God in the church.
Okay.
That is reconciliation of mankind.
Yeah.
But the problematic thing in this verse in Colossians is he says to reconcile all things, it's neuter plural, unto him, having made peace by the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in the heavens. What does he mean by things in the heavens?
I don't know.
Does he mean to include angels in that? I don't think so, because...
Would that be like a reference all the way back to, like, Genesis 3?
Genesis 6?
Well, but when he's talking about, like, the Nephilim and all these other
Genesis
different things.
6.
That's 6? Okay.
But if you go to Hebrews chapter 2...
Okay.
And I think it's verse 16...
Let's see. Hebrews chapter 2.
Yeah, start with 14 and read through 17.
All right. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. For surely it is not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham.
All right, so...
Yeah.
It seems to me that the book of Colossians is not talking about the reconciling of angels.
Okay.
So what could he mean when he said to reconcile all things to himself, whether things on earth or things in the heavens? Could he be talking about people who are now alive on earth, or people that are now in the heavens that have been reconciled by the blood of his cross? that would certainly fit with everything else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So is that the cosmic reconciliation the questioner was referring to, or does the questioner have the idea that someday all people will be reconciled to God? Is it a universalism? And the answer to that is no. The Bible does not teach that. Many passages, it's the few that are going to be saved. Matthew 7:13 and 14. Most are traveling the Broadway. Only a few will find the narrow way.
Yeah.
1 Peter 3, a few, that is 8 souls, were reconciled, were saved through the water.
Yeah.
At the end of the parable of the great banquet, many are called, but few are chosen. So we could go on and on. So that's a big fat no. So then does one mean, in some sense, the reconciliation of the natural creation to God?
Yeah. And that's where reading that, on first glance, I guess probably I would naturally just hear heaven and earth and put those as like the earth and the heavens. And I would read that
as the natural creation.
The natural creation somehow being reconciled.
And of course, you'd be going to like Romans 8.
Okay.
And start with verse 18 and read through verse 21.
Okay. Let's see. 18 through 21. For I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope.
Keep going.
That the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God.
All right, so there is a certain theology there that not only human beings, but all of creation is going to be set free from its bondage to corruption one day, and and it will be renewed. And so there is that idea of the reconciliation of creation. We're not sure, I'm not sure, which one the person had in mind, but maybe we've covered a few of the bases there anyway.
Yeah. I think suffice it to say that reconciliation is a bigger topic than most people probably consider.
Yeah. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, if any man is in Christ, he is a new creation.
Yeah.
Behold, old things have passed away, all things have become new. But if you read Revelation 21 about the new heavens and the new earth, it also says the former things have passed away. So you have the Isaiah 65 reflected in both of those, and so it seems to me that Paul's theology was that the renewal and reconciliation that happens for one individual when that person is reconciled to God is an anticipation
of all
of the cosmic reconciliation that will take place only at the end.
Yeah.
That's a big can of worms, but anyway,
it's a lot. But I think that was part of the deal is we kind of had one statement about it at the end of that video, and so the person was like, hey, can you give me a little more there?
If you wanted just a little bitty 1 ounce can of worms opened up when you asked that question, it's actually this great old big can of worms, which we just opened up, but there's a lot in that question.
Suffice it to say,
the worms are squiggling everywhere, Jed.
But the end of it, I think, is always
Canadian
going to be
night
a
crawlers.
good end.
Okay.
Okay. But I mean, it's a good thing for things to be reconciled to God.
Absolutely.
So in whatever format it is,
yes,
it's always going to be something we anticipate and look forward to.
That's right.
It's a promise of God's.
The separation that occurred in Eden has been the constant purpose of God to rectify that separation.
Oh, yeah.
That's the bottom line of it all.
I mean, going again back kind of those things in Genesis, it's painful to read, right before Noah, where you see God like regretting and feeling sorrow.
It grieved God in his heart.
Yes. Yeah. So the idea that's kind of been his greatest work is to try to bring everything back together again.
Which all and somehow goes to the cross.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, like I say, those are 3 kind of follow-ups that we've had from videos. As you could see as we were flipping around with the papers here.
Those are the worms.
Those are the worms.
I think it's time for us to get out of this.
He was eaten by worms.
Okay.
But we've got a lot of good follow-up, a lot of good video ideas and different things coming up. So stick with us and keep those comments coming in. We try to respond to several of them directly, but some of them are worth pulling together a whole video on every now and again. So thanks, Dan, for your time. Thanks, everyone, for your time and watching.
And we'll see you later.
And
don't have fun on these. You're not supposed to have fun.
We'll go think about worms some more. See y'all next time.